I still dream about it. Not every night, and not with the frequency of the earlier years, but consistently enough, across 50 years, that the dreaming is itself a fact about my life, a piece of data about what the interior has been doing while the exterior was living the life I actually chose. And the dreaming has taught me something about the road not taken that I could not have learned any other way, which is that the road not taken does not go away and is not supposed to go away, and that the making of peace with it is not the elimination of it, but something considerably more honest and more interesting than that. My name is Arthur. I'm 83 years old, and in the autumn of 1973, when I was 33 years old, I made a choice that redirected everything, and I have been carrying the alternative version of the life that choice foreclosed as a parallel narrative for 50 years. And what I want to tell you today is what 50 years of carrying it has finally taught me about what it is and what it is for. I need to tell you about the choice before I can tell you about the carrying, because the carrying is not fully intelligible without the specific weight of what it is that is being carried. And the specific weight of this particular thing is the specific weight of a life that was genuinely possible and that I genuinely wanted and that I chose, for reasons that were real and that I will account honestly not to pursue. I grew up in a small city in Ohio, the son of a man who worked at a manufacturing plant and a mother who taught elementary school. And the childhood was good in the ways that a stable and loving working-class Midwestern childhood of the 1950s was good, which is to say it was materially sufficient and emotionally present and organized around the values of work and reliability and the steady maintenance of the life, rather than the questioning of whether the life being steadily maintained was the right life or whether a different life was available. The questioning of the available lives was not a primary activity of the household I grew up in, and I absorbed the not questioning as I absorbed most of the household's primary values, thoroughly and without much awareness that the absorbing was happening. I was the first person in my family to go to college, which I did on a partial scholarship to a state university in 1958, and the going was itself the first significant departure from the pattern the household had established, the first indication that the life available to me might be organized differently from the lives of the people who had raised me. And the departure produced in me a quality of expanded possibility that the household had not previously provided, the sense of a world considerably larger than the world I had grown up in, and of a self that might be larger than the self the household had imagined into being. I studied literature. This is the fact most relevant to the story I am going to tell you, and I want to say it with the weight it deserves, because the studying of literature was not, for me, a practical choice or a credentialing choice, but a genuine and consuming engagement with the thing itself, with the specific and irreplaceable experience of reading the work that the best writers produce and understanding, in the reading of it, something about the interior of human experience that no other form of knowledge delivers in quite the same way. I loved it with the completeness that the best loves produce, the completeness that makes the loved thing feel continuous with the self, rather than external to it, and the loving produced in me, across 4 years of the studying, the understanding that I wanted to write, that the work I most wanted to do in my life was the work of the writer. And this understanding was the clearest and most certain thing I had produced from the 4 years of college, and the first genuine meeting I had had with my own deepest desire. I did not pursue it immediately. The not pursuing immediately was partly the practical reality of a 22-year-old from a working-class family who had a student loan and no financial cushion, and a clear understanding that the writing, in the short term, was not going to produce the income that the student loan required, and partly the formation, the not questioning of the available lives that the household had installed, the tendency to move toward the reliable and the proven rather than the uncertain and the genuinely wanted. I took a job teaching high school English in Cleveland, which was the closest available thing to the literature degree and to the writing without being either of those things fully. And I told myself the teaching was the preparation, the accumulation of the financial stability and the life experience that the writing, when I finally turned to it, would require. The teaching was not bad. I want to say that clearly because the account of the years between the desire and the choice they foreclosed, it could be received as the account of wasted years. And it was not that. Was the genuine and sometimes meaningful work of a person who was good at teaching and who cared about his students and who found, in the daily work of introducing young people to the literature he loved, a real if reduced version of the engagement with the thing itself, that the writing would have been the full version of all. I taught for 9 years, from 1962 to 1971, and in those 9 years I wrote in the margins, kept the notebooks, worked on the stories and the essays that I was not submitting to anyone, because the submitting felt premature, felt like the moving to the next stage before the current stage had produced the readiness that I was waiting to feel. I met my wife Carol in 1965, 3 years into the teaching, and we married in 1967. And the marriage is the central fact of the life I actually lived, and the context within which the choice of 1973 was made. And I want to be honest about the marriage in the full form that the honesty requires, which means saying that the marriage was genuinely and durably good, and also that it was one of the weights on the scale in 1973 when the choice was made, not because Carol asked me to make the choice she asked me to make, or pressured me toward it in any way I could identify as pressure, but because the marriage and the child we had by 1973, a daughter named Ruth, had created a set of stakes around the choosing that the choosing at 22 would not have had. And the stakes were real and were mine to weigh, and I weighed them in the direction I weighed them. The choice of 1973 was the choice between staying in the teaching, which by then had become a stable and modestly comfortable professional life in Cleveland, with a wife and a daughter and a mortgage, and the ordinary structures of a life that is building itself toward security, and accepting an offer that had come to me through a former professor, an offer to join a very small literary magazine in New York as an editor, a magazine that paid almost nothing and that occupied uncertain financial ground, and that was, by every practical measure available to a 33-year-old man with a wife and a daughter and a mortgage in Cleveland, the wrong choice, the risky choice, the choice that the formation had not prepared me to make, and that the stakes of the life I had built made considerably more difficult to make than it would have been at 22. The magazine was real. I want to tell you about it because the alternative life I have been carrying for 50 years has a specific shape, and that specific shape requires the specific facts that give it that shape rather than the general form of the road not taken that could belong to anyone. The magazine was called Meridian, and it was edited by a man named Thomas Ellison, who had been my professor at the State University in the early 1960s, and who had, across the decades since, built something small and genuine and serious in New York, a magazine that published the kind of literary work that the larger publications were not publishing, the work that was doing something new, and that required the specific kind of attention and the specific kind of editorial judgment that Thomas had and that he believed, on the basis of 9 years of watching me from a distance and reading what I sent him occasionally, that I had as well. He called me in the spring of 1973 and made the offer in the direct and unembellished way that Thomas made everything, told me what the magazine was and what the position would involve and what it paid, which was less than half of what the teaching was paying, and told me that he thought I was wasting myself in the classroom, and that the work the magazine was doing was the work I was actually suited for, and that the offer was genuine, and that the door was open, but not indefinitely open. I thanked him and told him I needed to think about it, and spent the summer of 1973 thinking about it with an intensity and a quality of genuine anguish that I have not experienced in any other decision in my life, before or since. I talked to Carol. The conversation was long and honest, and Carol, who was then 29 years old, and who had a 3-year-old daughter, and who had built her own professional life as a nurse in Cleveland, told me that she would support whatever I decided. And I believed her, and the believing did not make the deciding easier, made it in some ways harder, because the absence of the external constraint meant that the deciding was entirely mine, and the weight of the entirely mine was the full weight of what I was choosing and what I was giving up in either direction. I chose Cleveland. In October of 1973, I called Thomas and told him I could not take the position and thanked him for the offer, and he said he understood, and the conversation was brief and without drama, and was the quietest possible form of a significant thing happening, which is often how the significant things happen, not with the drama that their significance seems to require, but in the ordinary and unremarkable form of a telephone call that lasts 4 minutes and that changes the shape of the life you are going to live. I have been honest with myself across 50 years of the carrying about why I chose Cleveland, because the honesty about the why is the thing that the carrying most requires if it is going to be carried in the productive, rather than the merely painful form. The honest account has several parts, and I want to tell you all of them. Part of it was the genuine love for Carol and Ruth, and the genuine unwillingness to ask them to absorb the risk of the New York choice, which was real and was significant, and was not simply the convenient excuse for the fearful choice, but the actual and weighty consideration of a man who had made commitments that he took seriously, and who was not willing to subordinate those commitments entirely to his own desire. Part of it was the fear, the formation-installed tendency to move toward the reliable and the proven that the household had produced in me, and that had been operating in the decisions of my professional life, since the first not pursuing immediately at 22. And the fear was real, and was not the whole story, but was more of the story than the genuine consideration of Carol and Ruth. And the honesty about the proportions has been the most difficult part of the 50 years of carrying. Part of it was the doubt, the specific and corrosive doubt about whether the desire was sufficient evidence of the capacity, whether the wanting to write and to edit and to be part of the making of the literary work I loved was the same thing as being equipped to do those things at the level the New York choice required. And the doubt was the formation again, but was also genuinely mine, was the honest uncertainty of a person who has been in the preparation for a long time, and who has not yet tested the preparation against the actual work, and who is afraid, in ways that are not entirely irrational, that the testing might produce an unfavorable result. I stayed in the teaching. The teaching continued for another 22 years, until I retired in 1995, and across those years I continued to write in the margins, continued to keep the notebooks and work on the essays and stories, and I published a small amount, enough to confirm that the capacity had been real, and not enough to constitute the life I had wanted. And the small amount is its own form of the honest accounting, the evidence that the desire was not a fantasy, and the evidence that the not pursuing was a choice, and not an inevitability. Meridian became something. I followed it across the years with the specific quality of attention that you bring to a thing that is the evidence of the road not taken, the thing that shows you what the other direction was actually producing, and what it was producing was significant, was the magazine that Thomas had believed it could be, the place where the new and the serious work found its first home, and it lasted until Thomas's death in 1991 and published, across its 18 years, work that mattered and that I have read with a complicated and genuine mixture of pride in what the thing was, and grief for the part I did not play in the making of it. I want to tell you about the dreaming, because the dreaming is the form the parallel narrative has taken most consistently across 50 years, and because the dreaming is itself interesting and worth examining, rather than simply noting as the symptom of the regret. The dreams are not nightmares, and they are not wish fulfillments in the simple sense, are not the dreams of a man who wakes from them with the sharp pain of the contrast between the dreamed life and the actual one. They are more nuanced than that, which I think is what 50 years of the carrying does to the thing carried, gives it the complexity that the unexamined version of it would not have. In the dreams, I am sometimes in New York at the magazine, doing the work, and the doing of the work in the dreams has the quality of genuine and specific pleasure, the pleasure of the right work being done by the right person. And I wake from those dreams, not with grief exactly, but with the specific and bittersweet quality of someone who has been in the presence of a thing they genuinely loved and who knows the presence was temporary. In other dreams, which are less frequent but more interesting, the two lives are somehow simultaneous, which is not possible in the waking life, but which the dreaming produces with the matter-of-fact logic of dreams. And in those dreams I am both in Cleveland and in New York, both in the life I chose and in the life I did not choose. And the simultaneity produces not the anguish that the waking accounting of the choice can produce, but something more like the natural and non-contradictory coexistence of two real things. And I wake from those dreams with the understanding that the dreaming is trying to tell me something about the relationship between the two lives that the waking accounting, with its insistence on the either-or, does not capture. I have a friend, a man named Bernard, who has been my closest friend for 40 years, and who is one of the 3 or 4 people in my life who know the full account of the 1973 choice and the 50 years of carrying. And Bernard said something to me in the late 1990s, when we were both in our late 50s, and I was in the middle of one of the periods when the carrying was more acute than usual, that I have thought about many times since, and that I believe is the most useful thing anyone has said to me about the road not taken in 50 years of people saying things about it. He said that the parallel narrative, the alternative life I was carrying alongside the actual life, was not a fiction, not a fantasy, and not a delusion, and not the mere projection of a disappointed man onto the blank screen of the unchosen direction. It was, he said, a real thing, the real life that existed in the form of the genuine possibility that the 1973 choice foreclosed, and the reality of it was precisely what made it worth carrying and worth honoring rather than trying to eliminate or manage into insignificance, and that the carrying of it was not the problem, but the relationship with the carrying was the question, a question of whether the parallel narrative was being carried in the form of the indictment of the life actually lived, or in the form of the honest acknowledgement that the life actually lived was one of the real possibilities available to a real person in 1973, and that the other possibility was equally real, and is still, in some form, present as the evidence of what the actual life was chosen in preference to. I have been thinking about the relationship with the carrying for the 25 years since Bernard said that, and the thinking has produced, slowly and imperfectly, and not in any linear way, the understanding I want to try to give you from 83 years and 50 years of the carrying. The parallel narrative is not the enemy. That is the first and most important thing, the thing that the 50 years have most thoroughly taught me, because I spent the first 20 of those years in a relationship with the parallel narrative. That was the relationship of someone trying to manage it into insignificance, trying to reduce it to the status of the mere fantasy, the mere daydream of a disappointed man, because the alternative, which was to acknowledge its reality, produced the feeling that the acknowledgement would be the indictment of the actual life, the verdict that the actual life was the lesser choice, and the verdict was what I was afraid of and what the managing was protecting me from. The parallel narrative is not the indictment of the actual life. This is the second thing, the understanding that the managing was organized to prevent me from having to look at directly, because the looking seemed to require the choosing between them in retrospect, the arriving at the conclusion that one of them was the right life and one of them was the wrong one. And the conclusion was what the managing was organized around the prevention of. But the looking does not require the choosing. The two lives were both real, both genuinely available in 1973, both genuinely wanted in different proportions and for different reasons, and the choice between them was made under the specific conditions of a specific moment in a specific life, and the choosing does not retroactively invalidate the unchosen, does not reduce the road not taken to the mere illusion of a road, and the acknowledgement of the parallel narratives. Reality is not the verdict against the actual life, but the honest recognition that the actual life was one of two real things, and that the other real thing is still, in the form of the parallel narrative, present in the interior life of the man who chose in the other direction. I have a good life. I want to say that with the fullness of what good means, when it is said honestly, rather than defensively, when it is the conclusion of a genuine accounting rather than the managed response to the implicit challenge of the alternative. Carol and I have been married for 56 years, and the marriage has been, across its full length, one of the genuine and irreplaceable goods of my life, the relationship in which I have been most fully known and most consistently loved, and in the presence of which the interior life has been most fully at home. Ruth is 56 years old and is a person I admire with the specific admiration that a parent has for a child who has become someone worth admiring not as a parent's projection, but as a person independently assessed. And she has 2 children of her own, who are the specific and unrepeatable delight that grandchildren are. The teaching produced things that matter. Across 33 years of it, I taught thousands of students, and some of them were changed by the encountering of the literature in my classroom, in the specific and lasting way that the encounter with great writing can change a person. And the changing of him is not the work of a wasted life, is the work of a life that produced something real, something that is dispersed now into the lives of people who are dispersed across the decades, and who carry something from the classroom that they might not be able to fully articulate, but that is present in them, and that came from the genuine engagement of a man who loved the work he was teaching, even when the teaching was not the work he had most wanted to do. I published a collection of essays in 2008. When I was 68 years old, it was put out by a small press and read by a few thousand people, and that was, by the only measure I am able to apply honestly, at 83, the fullest expression of the writing capacity that the 1973 choice had rooted into the margins rather than the center, and the publishing of it produced in me a quality of satisfaction that was not the satisfaction of the New York life, was not what Meridian would have been, and was real, and was mine, and was produced by the same capacity that Thomas Ellison had seen in 1973, and that 50 years of the margins had not eliminated. I want to tell you about the specific understanding I have arrived at about the road not taken, and what it means to live with it, because the arrived at understanding is the reason I am telling you this, and not simply the history of the choice and the carrying. And the arrived at understanding is the most important thing I have to give you from 83 years and 50 years of the specific experience of being a person who made a significant choice and who has carried the alternative alongside the actual for the full length of the choosing. The road not taken is not the measure of the road taken. I want to start there because I think this is the most common and the most costly error in the relationship with the parallel narrative. The error of using the imagined life as the standard against which the actual life is assessed. The error of comparing the actual with all its costs and compromises, and ordinary Tuesday disappointments against the imagined with its idealized and unencumbered form. The form that the imagined always takes, because the imagined has not been subjected to the actual conditions that the actual has been subjected to, and that produce the costs and compromises and ordinary Tuesday disappointments that are simply what any life, lived fully and in the actual world, contains. The Meridian life, had I lived it, would have had its own costs and compromises, and ordinary Tuesday disappointments, would have had the financial precariousness that the choice would have required, and the professional uncertainties that the small literary magazine life was organized around, and the specific and particular losses and difficulties that any actual life contains that the imagined version is always mercifully spared. The parallel narrative I have been carrying for 50 years is the idealized form of the alternative, and the idealized form is not the accurate form, and the comparison of the actual life to the idealized alternative is a comparison that the actual life will always lose, because it is comparing the actual to the ideal, and the actual is always different from the ideal in the direction of the harder and the more complicated. This does not mean the parallel narrative is a fiction. I have said that it is real, and I mean it, and I am not revising it. What I mean is that the reality of it is the reality of a genuine possibility that was available and was unchosen, and that exists in the form of the genuine alternative that it was, not in the idealized form that the carrying tends to produce across 50 years of not being subjected to the actual conditions of the actual world. What I have arrived at, across the years of the carrying and the thinking about the carrying, is something that I can only describe as the honest coexistence of the two lives, the actual and the alternative, held simultaneously in the interior, without the requirement that one of them be the indictment of the other, without the verdict that the actual accounting of a major life choice always seems to be reaching for, and without the managing of the alternative into insignificance that the fear of the verdict produced in the early years of the carrying. The two lives coexist in me, honestly, the actual and the alternative, and the coexistence is not painful in the way it was painful for the first 20 years, and is not comfortable in the way the managing produced a kind of comfort, and is something else, something that I find at 83 to be the most honest and most genuinely at peace relationship I have had with the choice in 50 years. I want to tell you about a specific moment that I think of as the turning point in the relationship with the carrying, not because turning points are usually as discrete and as locatable as they seem in retrospect, but because this one genuinely was discrete, and genuinely was the moment when the relationship with the parallel narrative shifted in the direction of the honest coexistence rather than the verdict. It was 1998, 25 years after the choice, and I was driving back from a visit to New York, where I had been for a conference, and I drove past the building on the Lower West Side where Meridian had been housed, where I had never been inside and had never visited, because the visiting would have been its own form of the confrontation I had been managing around, and something made me park the car and stand outside the building for a few minutes, looking at it in the way that you look at the physical evidence of the road not taken when you are 58 years old and have been carrying it for 25 years and have never looked at the physical evidence directly. It was an ordinary building. I want to say that because the ordinariness of it was the thing that produced the shift, the specific and somewhat deflating recognition that the place where the alternative life would have been lived was an ordinary building on an ordinary street in a real city, a building that was now housing something else entirely because Meridian had been gone for 7 years, a building that did not know and could not know the weight I had been assigning to the address for 25 years. And the ordinariness of it standing in front of me was the first real intrusion of the actual into the imagined alternative, the first time the parallel narrative had been confronted with the physical fact of the world, rather than allowed to remain in the interior, where the imagined and the actual are not required to coexist in the same space. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes and thought about Thomas, who had been dead for 7 years, and whom I had never managed to fully reconnect with after the 1973 refusal, which is its own form of the cost, and its own thing I carry alongside the primary thing. And I thought about what the building had contained across its 18 years as the home of the magazine, the actual work done by actual people in actual conditions. And I thought about the specific and ordinary difficulty of that work, the small budgets and the uncertain futures, and the daily grind of the actual rather than the imagined. And I felt, standing on that street in 1998, something I had not felt in 25 years of the carrying, which was something in the neighborhood of the honest coexistence, the first genuine sense that the alternative was real and ordinary and actual rather than ideal and complete and unencumbered, and that its reality and ordinariness did not diminish it, but made it possible to hold alongside the actual life without the actual life always losing the comparison. I drove back to Cleveland that evening and told Carol where I had been and what I had been thinking, and she listened in the way she listens, with the specific quality of attention that 50 years of being listened to by Carol have taught me is one of the genuine and irreplaceable goods of the actual life. And she said, after I finished, that she thought I had been carrying the magazine as the ideal for so long that the first encounter with its ordinariness was probably exactly what the carrying had needed. And she said it with the directness and the warmth that she brings to most things, and that I have valued with a depth I do not always express as fully as the depth deserves. I want to say something directly to you, from 83 years and 50 years of carrying the specific weight of the road not taken, because I think what I have learned from the carrying is more useful than the general wisdom about regret that is available in abundance, and that is usually either too consoling or too severe. Either the reassurance that the life you lived was the right one, or the warning that the failure to live the life you wanted was a failure of courage or authenticity. And neither of those framings is accurate, and neither is useful in the way that the honest account of the actual experience of living with a genuine alternative is useful. The road not taken is real. Let it be real. The managing of it into the mere fantasy, the mere symptom of disappointment, the thing to be overcome and released and transcended in the direction of the full acceptance of the actual life, is not the honest relationship with it, and is not the peaceful one. The peace, the genuine peace, which I have arrived at imperfectly and across a long time, is not the peace of the elimination, but the peace of the honest coexistence. The peace of two real things held simultaneously in the interior, without the requirement that one of them be the indictment of the other, without the verdict, without the comparison that the actual will always lose. The actual life is not the consolation prize for the unchosen life. I want to say that as directly as I can, because I spent the first part of the 50 years of carrying in a relationship with the actual that had the quality of the consolation prize, the sense that the actual was what remained after the real choice had been foreclosed, and the consolation prize relationship with the actual life is the most costly thing the parallel narrative produces when it is not being carried in the honest form, because the consolation prize relationship with the actual means that you are never quite fully in the actual, are always somewhat in the alternative, and the not being fully in the actual has costs that compound across the years in the form of the actual life not being attended to with the quality of presence that it deserves and that produces, at the end of the accounting, a life that was lived at a slight remove from itself, rather than in the full possession of itself that is available when the parallel narrative is being carried in the form of the honest coexistence rather than the indictment. Carol has the quality of presence. That is the thing about her that I most value, and that the 50 years of marriage have most consistently provided, the quality of being fully in the actual life without the parallel narrative running in the background, and the being in the actual that her presence models has been, across 50 years of the marriage, the most consistent and most available correction to the tendency the carrying produces to be somewhat elsewhere, somewhat in the alternative. And the correction has not been perfect, and has been real, and has been one of the genuine goods of the actual life that the idealized alternative would not have provided, because the idealized alternative did not include Carol. I am 83 years old, and I still dream about it. And the dreaming is not the wound, and the dreaming is not the healing, and the dreaming is the honest interior of a man who made a genuine choice between two genuine things, and who has been carrying the unchosen genuine thing for 50 years, and who has arrived, finally and imperfectly, and at the cost of the 50 years of the carrying, at the honest coexistence, the place where the actual and the alternative are both real, and neither is the indictment of the other, and the actual life is inhabited fully rather than from the remove of the parallel narrative. If you are carrying something like this, if you have a road not taken that runs alongside the actual life as the parallel narrative that does not go away, and that you have perhaps been managing into the manageable form rather than carrying in the honest form, I want to say what I wish someone had said to me in the early years of the carrying, which is that the not going away is not the problem, and is not the evidence of the unresolved or the unhealed, or the failure to achieve the acceptance that the wisdom about regret is always pointing toward. The not going away is the evidence that the road was real, that the alternative was genuine, that the choice you made was a choice between two actual things rather than between the actual and the illusory. And the reality of the unchosen road is the evidence of the significance of the person who chose, the evidence that the life contained a genuine fork, and that the person standing at the fork was someone for whom both directions were genuinely available. That is not a small thing to have been. It is the evidence of a life that had real possibilities, and a self that was capable of more than one direction. And the carrying of the unchosen direction is the honest acknowledgement of both of those facts. And the honest acknowledgement, held without the verdict, and without the indictment, and without the managing, is the most complete relationship available to you with the full truth of the life you have actually lived. I am 83 years old. I still dream about it. And the dreaming is the honest interior doing what it has always done, carrying the full account of a real man who stood at a real fork in 1973 and went one way and has been, in the specific and genuine form of the parallel narrative, going both ways ever since. And the going both ways is not the failure, and is not the haunting, and is finally, at 83 years old and 50 years into the carrying, the honest coexistence that I was always reaching for, and that the reaching was always, in its own imperfect and long-winded way, the right direction.